After 50 years of work, the company I gave my life to threw a retirement party and left me out. They laughed, they clapped, they raised their glasses without even saying my name. Someone whispered I had been called forgotten. Forgotten after half a century. That word cut deeper than any wound I carried from the job. But what they didn't know was that the very ground they were standing on, the place where they poured their drinks and cheered, had my name written on it. Thank you for watching and staying with me. I would love for you to tell me in the comments where you are watching from, because it means a lot to know who is listening to my story. My name is Henry, and I live in Colorado, a place of wide skies and mountains that have watched me grow old with time. I spent 50 long years of my life working for one company, clocking in and out every day, believing that loyalty meant something, that giving your strength and your health would one day be remembered with respect. I started there when I was just a young man, full of energy and hope, and I held on to that belief through storms, through sickness, through the nights when I walked home so tired that my legs trembled, through the mornings when I missed family birthdays because a shift could not be left uncovered. I gave them my hands and my back, but I also gave them the moments of life that I can never take back, because I thought a man's word and a man's service counted for something. When younger men came and left chasing bigger salaries, I stayed, and I told myself that roots are stronger than branches, that someday they would look at me and say, "Here is a man who gave his all." For decades, I carried that quiet pride, and it became a part of me, the way the calluses on my hands became a part of me, the way the smell of oil and dust never seemed to leave my clothes. And yet, when the years finally caught up with me, when my shoulders no longer lifted as they once had, when my hair turned silver, and when I believed they would honor me for giving them my life, they chose to forget me. I want you to understand the kind of life I led, because it was not a life of riches or ease, it was a life of steady work and sacrifice, the kind of life many of you know well. I thought that counted for something, that it was enough to show up every day, to build with my hands and my heart. But the night I learned of that party without my name, that belief crumbled, and I realized the truth, that in their eyes I was just another man who could be replaced, someone no longer needed, someone they dared to call forgotten. When I look back now, I see how the signs had been there long before that party, but I was too loyal, or maybe too blind, to admit them. In the early years, they would shake my hand, thank me for my work, call me reliable, the kind of man they could always count on. As time passed and new faces filled the office, younger men with polished shoes and smooth words, my name was called less and less. They would sit in meetings and I would share ideas born from experience, from sweat, from nights fixing problems that would have shut the whole place down, if not for me. And those same ideas were brushed aside, as though they were nothing. Yet weeks later, I would hear those same words come from the mouths of younger men, spoken like fresh thoughts, and everyone would nod and clap for them as if they had built something new. I told myself not to mind it, that maybe this was the way of the world, that the old step aside so the new can shine. But every time it happened, a piece of me felt smaller. I tried to remind myself that my day would come, that when my time was done, they would gather in that big hall, raise their glasses, and tell stories about Henry from Colorado, the man who gave them 50 years. I even pictured myself standing there with my family, listening as they finally recognized what my life had been worth. I held onto that picture so tightly that it blinded me from what was real. There were days I would see the laughter of my coworkers in the break room, and when I walked in, the room grew quieter, almost as if my presence was no longer welcome. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just in my head, but deep down I felt the distance growing, as though time itself was pushing me into the shadows. Still, I worked, I kept my head down. I told myself that loyalty was not wasted, that respect would come, even if it was late. And then came the whispers of that party. I did not hear it from a manager, not even from someone close to me. I heard it in passing, like a secret I was never meant to know. At first I thought maybe my invitation had been lost, that it was some mistake, because how could 50 years of my life be overlooked? But the truth came clear when a colleague leaned closer and with pity in his eyes, told me quietly, "They said you were just forgotten." That word, forgotten, rang in my ears. I went home that night and sat in silence, the image of the celebration I had waited for dissolving into nothing. It felt like the ground beneath me had given way. I was not honored. I was not remembered. I was erased. And that pain, sharper than any hardship I had faced on the job, settled deep in my chest, reminding me that the loyalty I gave so freely had meant nothing to them. That night, after I sat in my chair and let the word forgotten echo in my mind, I tried to picture what was happening inside that office hall. I could see them raising glasses filled with champagne, balloons strung across the ceiling, laughter bouncing from wall to wall, speeches being made about the future of the company, about the young men who would lead it forward. I could almost hear the music playing and the clinking of glasses as they toasted to a tomorrow where my name was nowhere to be found. And while they celebrated, I sat in the quiet of my small living room, the clock ticking too loudly, the silence pressing against me until it felt like I was suffocating. The very hall I had helped build, brick by brick, was filled with people who could not even remember to include me in a single invitation. I remember staring at my hands that night, hands that had once been strong, hands that lifted steel, carried lumber, signed contracts, repaired what was broken, and guided younger men through mistakes they did not yet know how to fix. Those hands shook slightly, not from weakness, but from the sting of being discarded like an old tool left to rust. I thought of the birthdays I missed, the times my wife sat alone at the dinner table waiting for me, the days I worked through sickness with a rag on my forehead, just so a machine would not shut down and cost the company thousands. I thought of the times I was told I was dependable, the times I stayed late without pay, believing that loyalty was worth more than money. Every one of those sacrifices came flooding back as I sat there, hearing their laughter in my imagination, and all of it seemed meaningless in that moment. And yet, beneath the ache in my chest, there was something else, a small spark that made me sit up straighter. They may have called me forgotten, but I knew something they had overlooked. While they celebrated without me, thinking they had erased me from their story, I remembered the papers tucked away in my safe, yellowed with age, but heavy with power. They had forgotten my name, but they had also forgotten who owned the ground under their feet. And as I sat in the quiet, a smile crept across my face, not from joy, but from the certainty that the story they thought had ended was about to take a turn they would never expect. As I sat there with that faint smile tugging at my lips, the word forgotten still rang in my mind, but it no longer carried the same weight. It had wounded me, yes, but now it began to remind me of the truth I had carried quietly for decades. Long before that company grew tall and proud, back when it was only a handful of men dreaming near the railroad tracks, I had taken what little savings I had and bought that piece of land. I was young then, and most people thought it was foolish, a waste of money on dirt and weeds, but I saw something different. I saw roots, I saw possibility, and I held on to that land as if it were a lifeline. When the company approached, eager to build its first office, they signed a lease and never looked deeper. They assumed ownership was theirs, and because I never flaunted it, because I never spoke of it, they forgot. Over the years, as walls rose and new buildings stretched high, I kept quiet. Rent came in, papers were renewed, and I said nothing. I was content to work among them, to build side by side with men who never suspected that the man in the overalls, the one sweating through double shifts, was also the man whose name was on the deed to the soil they walked on. For me, it was never about power or pride, it was about security, about knowing that no matter how hard life pressed me, I had something solid beneath me. And so I stayed silent, letting them believe the land was theirs, letting them believe I was only a worker, a small piece in their machine. But that night when I was called forgotten, something in me shifted. The land was more than dirt, it was memory. It was proof of who I was and what I had built, even when no one was watching. Every brick they stacked, every window they polished, stood upon the choice I had made long ago. And while they chose to erase me from their party, they could not erase me from the ground beneath their feet. That thought gave me strength, and the bitterness in my chest began to fade, replaced by a quiet fire that spread through me. They thought the story was over, but I knew it had only just begun. The papers in my safe were no longer just documents. They were a voice, louder than any toast, stronger than any speech, waiting to remind them that I was not forgotten. I was the foundation they had overlooked. The longer I sat thinking of those papers locked away, the clearer it became that the pain they caused me with that word forgotten could no longer hold me down, because I had the truth, and the truth was stronger than their applause, their banners, or their shallow speeches. I remembered the day I tucked that deed away, my hands younger then, my heart full of determination, telling myself that no matter what storms came, no matter how the world changed, my family and I would always have a foundation that no one could take from us. That memory rose up in me like an anchor holding steady in rough waters, and I felt a calm strength building where bitterness had been only moments before. I thought of all the times I had chosen silence, the times I had swallowed pride to keep peace, the times I had bowed my head and let others take credit because I believed my day would come. Perhaps my day had not arrived in the way I once dreamed, not with speeches or gifts, but it was coming in a way far more powerful. I would not need their invitations, their handshakes, or their staged smiles. I would walk in with proof that while they had tried to erase me from memory, my name had always been written deeper, beneath the soil, beneath the walls, carved in a place they could never reach. And as these thoughts settled inside me, I felt less like a man cast aside, and more like a man awakening to who he truly was. They saw me as a relic, someone to be brushed away, but I was more than their dismissal. I was the foundation they stood on, the unseen hand that had held them steady all along. That realization gave me a peace I had not felt in years, and with it came resolve. Tomorrow would not be like today. Tomorrow I would rise from the silence they placed me in, and I would remind them, not with anger, not with loud words, but with the quiet truth of a deed that had been mine all along. They called me forgotten, but the ground itself remembered me, and soon so would they. That night I finally rose from my chair and walked to the old safe that had been with me for decades, the same safe that held not only papers but pieces of my life, moments I had chosen to protect when the world outside felt uncertain. My hands, older now and marked with the lines of time, turned the dial slowly until I heard the familiar click, and when the heavy door swung open, the smell of old paper and iron filled the room. Inside, tucked beneath letters and photographs, lay the deed that had been mine since those early years when the company was nothing but a dream taking shape. I lifted it carefully, the edges yellowed with age, and as I held it, I felt as though I was holding not just a document, but every sacrifice, every long shift, every moment of loyalty that had gone unseen. I remembered the day I signed it, how small and unimportant I seemed then. A young man with little more than determination in his pockets, taking a chance that no one else thought was worth the risk. They saw a patch of ground by the railroad tracks, nothing more, but I saw a place that could stand strong. And when the company later came to build their offices, eager to make a mark, I was there, quietly watching as they laid bricks upon land they believed was theirs. I said nothing, because sometimes silence protects more than noise ever could, and I knew that the ground would always know my name, even if people forgot it. Now, holding that deed, I felt the weight of 50 years pressing against me, but it no longer crushed me, it lifted me. Their party without me, their careless laughter, their cruel word forgotten, all of it seemed small compared to the truth in my hands. This piece of paper was stronger than every speech they gave, every banner they hung, every toast they raised. It was the reminder that while they had overlooked me, I had never overlooked what mattered most. In that moment, my pain shifted into purpose, and I knew that tomorrow I would not walk into their office as a man seeking recognition. I would walk in as the owner of the very foundation they stood upon. The next morning I rose before the sun, the deed folded carefully inside my jacket, and for the first time in many years I did not feel like a man walking toward work. I felt like a man walking toward truth. The air outside was cool and sharp, carrying with it a kind of stillness that made every step feel heavier with meaning. As I made my way toward the building, I looked up at its tall glass windows, catching the early light, And I thought of how proud they had always been of that office, how they spoke of it as if it were their monument, forgetting that monuments crumble when they are not built on respect. I walked through the front doors, and the sound of my shoes on the polished floor echoed through the lobby, drawing the eyes of those who were arriving to start their day. I could see their surprise, some even whispering, as if my presence did not belong there anymore. I did not rush, I did not bow my head. I carried myself with the same calm weight I had carried through every storm of my life. When I reached the reception desk, I asked to see the man at the top, the one who had raised his glass in my absence the night before. At first, the young woman behind the desk looked confused, then uneasy, and though she hesitated, she knew by the firmness in my eyes that I would not be turned away. I was led down a long hallway, each step steady, each breath reminding me of the papers folded against my chest. As I entered his office, he looked up from behind that wide desk, his face carrying that smug smile I had seen so many times before, the smile of a man who thought he held all the power. He leaned back in his chair and said with a smirk, "Henry, what are you doing here, old man? Yesterday was about the future, not the past." His words were meant to sting, but they rolled off me like rain against stone, because I knew what he did not yet know. Without a word, I reached into my jacket, placed the deed on his desk, and slid it toward him. The smile faded from his face as his eyes scanned the paper, the color draining from his cheeks as the truth settled in. I did not raise my voice, I did not gloat. I simply said with steady calm, "You forgot to invite me, but you also forgot who owns the ground you are standing on." He sat there frozen, his hand trembling slightly as he held the paper, his eyes darting back and forth across the words that spelled out the truth he had never once considered. For years he had looked at me as nothing more than a worn-out worker, someone to be brushed aside when the new generation came in. But now he realized that the very walls around him, the floors beneath his chair, the hall where they had toasted my absence the night before, all of it rested on a foundation that was mine. I could see the confidence draining from his face, that smirk gone, replaced by the look of a man who suddenly understood that the power he thought he owned had been borrowed all along. The silence between us grew thick, heavier than any words I could have spoken, and I let it sit there until he shifted uncomfortably, clearing his throat, trying to mask his shock with a false calm. "This must be some mistake," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him, thin and uneasy, as if he already knew it was no mistake at all. I leaned forward just enough for my words to carry the weight of truth without the need for anger. "You celebrated my absence," I said quietly, "but without me, there would be no place to celebrate. You forgot me, but the land did not forget my name." His eyes met mine, and for the first time in all the years I had known him, there was no arrogance there, no dismissal, only the realization that he had underestimated me, that the man he thought invisible had been the one holding the ground firm beneath him. Outside his door I could hear the faint stir of voices, whispers spreading as word of what was happening began to ripple through the building. I did not need to shout, I did not need to demand respect, because the truth spoke louder than I ever could. I rose from my chair, left the papers on his desk, and with calm certainty I said, "You called me forgotten, but today you will remember me every time you step through these doors." When I opened the door to leave his office, I found more eyes on me than I had expected. Word must have traveled faster than footsteps, because men and women stood in the hallway, their conversations hushed, their faces carrying the kind of curiosity that comes when something important is unfolding behind closed doors. Some of them had been at that party the night before, glasses in hand while they clapped for one another, never once thinking of me, and now those same hands hung at their sides as they whispered to each other in disbelief. I could see the shock on their faces as they realized the truth, that the man they had dismissed as an old relic was the very one who held the ground they stood on. I did not raise my head higher than theirs. I did not glare or scold. I simply walked past them with the steady calm of someone who no longer needed to fight for recognition. Their silence was heavier than any cheer they could have given me. And in that silence, I heard the weight of respect finally fall where it belonged. Behind me, I could still hear the voice of their leader, tense and hurried, calling for someone to bring in the company lawyers, his tone stripped of arrogance, his words sharp with worry. And though I did not turn back, I knew the moment was burning itself into the memory of everyone who watched. A lesson written not in anger but in truth. Each step I took through that building felt different than the thousands I had taken before. For years I had walked those halls as a man invisible, another pair of hands, another clock number. But now every corner seemed to echo with the truth they had forgotten. Some lowered their eyes as I passed, perhaps out of shame, perhaps out of respect, but I did not need either from them. I walked with the quiet dignity of a man who had been erased from their celebration, yet had reminded them all that foundations are never forgotten. And as the doors opened and I stepped back into the daylight, I carried not only the papers I had laid down, but also the calm certainty that my silence had spoken louder than their cheers ever could. As I stepped out into the daylight, the cool air touched my face, and I felt a stillness settle deep inside me. The kind of stillness that only comes when a burden has finally been lifted after years of being carried in silence. For so long I had believed that recognition would come from speeches and handshakes, from banners hung high and words spoken at a party, but in that moment I understood something greater. That recognition does not always come from others. Sometimes it comes from the truth we carry quietly until the day it must be revealed. I thought of the word they had used, forgotten, and how it had pierced me like a knife. But now that same word no longer carried pain. It had become the reminder that while they forgot me, I never forgot who I was. As I walked down the steps of that building, I thought of the years I had given and how quickly they had tried to erase them. But I also thought of the land I had bought so long ago, how it had stood steady beneath storms and seasons, waiting for the day when it would speak on my behalf. And that day had come. They had toasted without me, laughed without me, but now every step they took inside that building would be a step on ground that bore my name, and whether they wanted to or not, they would remember me. That thought filled me with a quiet peace, because I no longer needed their applause to measure my worth. I had proven it with every sacrifice, every long shift, and finally with the truth that had been mine all along. The irony was not lost on me, that the same people who had brushed me aside, who thought me too old, too small, too unimportant to honor, would now begin each day under the shadow of a truth they could never erase. It was not revenge that I carried in my heart as I walked away. It was something gentler, stronger, a dignity that had survived being overlooked and had risen higher because of it. For the first time in many years, I felt free, not bound by their opinions or their judgments, but rooted in the knowledge that I had left my mark in a way no party or speech ever could. And as the sun warmed my back, I knew that being called forgotten had given me the chance to show them that some names, no matter how hard others try to erase them, will always remain written in stone. In the days that followed, I did not hear laughter echoing from that building the way it had before, and I knew the air inside had changed. The men and women who once walked past me as if I were invisible now looked at me with eyes that carried both respect and unease, because they finally understood what they had overlooked for so long. The company that thought they could erase me with silence now had to meet me with open hands and lowered voices, forced to sit across from me at the table and speak of new lease terms, their confidence replaced with careful words. I did not need to raise my tone. I did not need to remind them of their cruelty, because the truth lay heavy between us every time they glanced at the deed. It was not revenge that guided me. It was not the hunger to see them beg. It was the simple need to reclaim my dignity, to make clear that a man's worth is not measured by the noise of a party, but by the roots he plants that cannot be pulled out. I set the terms fairly, not cruelly, because dignity does not need to strike back. It only needs to stand tall. And I left those meetings with a calm heart, knowing that justice had been done in the quietest way. They could no longer walk their halls without remembering me. They could no longer raise their glasses without feeling the weight of the ground beneath them. My name was not on their invitation, but it was written deeper, where no one could tear it away. For me, Life after that moment was different. I no longer looked back with bitterness. I no longer replayed the scene of that party in my mind, because I had found a peace that outlasted their laughter. The land had spoken for me, the truth had carried me, and I had shown them that being forgotten does not mean being gone. Some things endure, some names remain, and sometimes the quietest victories leave the deepest marks. And in the stillness of those evenings that followed, as I sat by my window with the sunset spilling across the mountains, I felt no anger toward them. Only the calm knowledge that they would never again look at me as if I did not matter. In the end, I realized that life does not always give us the recognition we expect, but it often gives us the chance to stand tall in ways we never imagined. They had erased me from their celebration, but I had written myself into their history without a word, and every step they take now will remind them of the man they once tried to forget. It is a strange kind of justice, not loud, not cruel, but steady, the kind that speaks long after the noise of a party has faded away. And for me, that was enough, because I found peace not in their approval, but in the dignity I carried within me all along. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. I truly appreciate you listening. If my story touched you, please subscribe and stay close, because I still have many truths left to share.